Hello, I'm Lindsay Lloyd. I'm the Director of the Human Freedom Initiative here at the George W. Bush Institute. Today we're really privileged to have Mike Abramowitz, the President of Freedom House, to talk with us a little bit about democracy and human rights. Mike, thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
Well, let's start off talking about the Freedom in the World report. As you say, it's one of the things Freedom House is best known for. We've seen more than a decade now of declines in freedom globally, in developed democracies, in partial democracies or partly free states, and in countries that are not free, where the trends basically seem to be going in the wrong direction. Why is that? What do you see as driving that?
Well, first, the trends are going in the right direction. We're just out with our 2020 report, and it basically shows that for the 14th consecutive year, you have more countries experiencing declines in political rights and civil liberties than those that are having an improvement. And so this is really kind of a proxy, I think, for the health of democracy. And you're seeing this phenomenon all over the world. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on countries like Russia, China, some smaller powers like Turkey, Venezuela, which are going in the wrong direction. These are, autocratic countries that have gotten worse over the last 10 to 15 years. But I think one of the other pieces of the puzzle is that in traditionally strong democracies, countries like India, the United States, and Western democracies, you also have a weakening of democratic standards and values.
Mm-hmm. Is there any one region that's particularly troubling to you, or is it sort of spread evenly? Or
this is a global phenomenon. I would say it's happening all over the world. I think the only region of the world that has not suffered a net decline over the last is Asia. Mm-hmm. But basically, this is a global phenomenon and one that is deeply worrisome. You asked about why this is happening. We could talk for many hours about that. But I think fundamentally there is a failure of a governance of delivery by leading democracies in delivering economic growth on a widespread, fair basis to people. You have the global immigration crisis, which I think is creating a lot of concern, especially in established democracies, and kind of opening the door to populists and demagogues who are offering simplistic solutions, I think, to some of these problems. And then thirdly, I think the issue of technology in democracy is something that we are quite focused on at Freedom House, that there are more, that the rise of the internet, the rise of new technologies, we thought maybe 10 years ago would be a boon for freedom. And I think we're finding that it actually is creating more tools for authoritarians to repress their own people.
Double-edged sword.
It's definitely a double-edged sword.
We just mentioned populism. Talk to me about that a little bit. What do you see as the impact of populism on democracy around the world, and sort of the roots of it? Is it what you were talking about, this failure of democracy to deliver, that's driving a lot of it, or are there other factors that are going on?
Well, I think there are a number of different factors about it. I kind of joke often that there are hundreds of different books out about this subject over the last couple of years, and they all are offered, slightly different, nuanced things. I think economy has a big part of it. And I think there are cultural issues too, where traditional working class folks and others, feeling that their livelihoods are being attacked and their cultural identity being attacked. I think it differs from place to place. There's right-wing versions of populism in places like Poland and Hungary. Then there's left-wing versions of populism in places like Venezuela. So it's a global phenomenon that takes place. And by the way, I don't necessarily think that populism is all a bad thing, in the sense that democracies have to be responsive to people, and it's totally legitimate for the people to raise concerns and to throw out people that they don't feel are delivering. But the question is, what do populists do when they get in power? And we've seen in cases of like Hungary or Venezuela, populists have really moved to restrict rights, to restrict liberty, to restrict freedom. That's what we're concerned about at Freedom House.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about globalism a little bit as a factor that's driving some of this. People are seeing jobs disappear, they're seeing migration, or they're seeing, sort of the old ways, the old order is sort of disappearing. That's obviously factoring into this somehow. Do elites sort of amplify this by promoting a globalist agenda, if you will, when the public may be looking for something very different? Do you see the media or entertainment industries or other international businesses kind of being part of the problem here that's causing these trends?
Well, I definitely think that globalization, as you say, is contributing to the problem in the way in the way that you mentioned. And I do think that sometimes there is a disconnect between elite thinking and so to speak, and the thinking of everyday voters. I think everyday voters sometimes think that the elites are out of touch, and sometimes they are. I certainly think that there's a requirement to listen to each other a little bit more deeply. I worry sometimes, certainly in our own country, about the level of polarization and the inability of people to really listen to people with whom they disagree and try to seek common ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about economics in terms of the lack of economic development or poor economic progress as being a real determinant in this?
It's a factor. One thing, though, that I'm kind of struck by sometimes is that the populist energy takes place even in places that are doing well economically. So there's no question that in certain parts of the world, and you think about the Rust Belt in the United States or Venezuela or other places where there is there's a real economic problems and there's a failure in some ways to kind of address those concerns. On the other hand, you take a place like Poland, which has been one of the countries we've been very concerned about at Freedom House over the last decade or so. And in Poland, there's really, they've done pretty well economically, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And yet there is a resentment against elite thinking, a resentment against, it's a kind of a cultural resentment that has led to an openness to populist answers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you used to hear a theory that as countries progress economically, as a middle class would develop, that democracy became almost inevitable. We see countries like China where there's been great economic progress, but very little political progress, or even a place like Singapore where you've had sort of a soft authoritarianism. Can poor democracies be sustained? Can they thrive, or is prosperity really an essential?
Well, I think China is an interesting case study because 20 or 30 years ago, the conventional wisdom with China was that as the country lifted itself out of the chaos and the poverty of the Mao era, that it would become more open to democratic values, more open to liberal values. Not that it would become kind of a democracy in the sense of U.S. or British or Western-style democracy, but that would be a more open society. And I think what you found that's really quite interesting and concerning in China is kind of substantial economic growth, but in a kind of an increasingly authoritarian context, where the people really, I think, even under our reports, starting from a low threshold, China is getting less free. And so that's of deep concern. I think in the long term, it's very hard to have economic growth in a kind of restricted setting where people are being essentially persecuted for their beliefs and for thinking creatively. I think that is going to be a problem for China. I also think that authoritarian countries like China are not immune from the kind of pressures that face democratically elected governments. And you think just about the Chinese response to the coronavirus, which from what I can see has not been very effective. And that I think is going to really raise growing concerns about this vaunted governance structure that they actually can't, because of their penchant for secrecy and closeness, respond to real problems.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about democracy and security, and particularly since 9/11, there's been a very heightened sense of the need to protect citizens against terrorists, either internal or external. How does that clash with people's desires for personal freedom, for personal liberty? What are the tensions there, and how is that playing out?
Well, there's definitely tension, and I think you find traditionally in democracies, in wartime or in perceived wartime settings, that governments are going to be more restrictive of civil liberties. of rights. In a democracy, there's always a challenge to balance those things. I think from at Freedom House, we take a more freedom loving approach, where we think that it's possible to protect freedom and to protect people effectively without resorting to infringements on civil liberties.
Mm-hmm. At the outset, you talked about how the general global trends in freedom are not good, but it's not bad news everywhere.
No, and that's an important point, Lindsay, that one of the things that's been really quite encouraging about the last couple of years in particular is that there are bright spots around the world. And I could give you a couple of examples. I mean, the first I would say is Hong Kong. Hong Kong, 3 million people out on the streets in the past year to demand their rights. It really shows that that the thirst for human rights and democracy is not a Western construct. It is in the hearts of people everywhere. And I'm not sure how that story is going to end up. I hope well, but I fear for the worst. But I do think it's an important sign, and that people do care for freedom. I think just a couple of other examples that I like to talk about. Another Chinese example is Taiwan. Taiwan is one of the most successful stories of democracy in the last 20 or 30 years. This was basically a military dictatorship, a generation ago. It's now, according to our scores, one of the freest countries and most democratic, one of the most vibrant democracies in the world. And they are doing that. They are the people who are really close to China, and they see the negativity of what's happening inside China, and they don't like it. One other example, just in a different context, that I like to talk about, because as you know, I used to work at the Holocaust Museum, working on issues of genocide, and I've been tracking events in Sudan for quite some time. Sudan has been one of the worst governed countries in Africa for a long time. They were basically under the heel of a dictator, President Bashir, who was even accused of conducting genocide in Darfur. And there was a people movement in Sudan led by ordinary professionals, doctors, lawyers, others, really without a lot of outside help, as best I could tell, who galvanized protests in response to the poor performance of the government that led to the ouster of President Bashir. And now there's a chance that he will be sent to the International Criminal Court to stand justice for his alleged crimes. So cases like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Sudan, really give me hope that in the long term, people would rather live in freedom than in slavery or under authoritarianism. But it's the struggle of our times. It's an existential struggle, and it's really important for people in democracies to make clear where their allegiances lie.
We talked a little bit earlier about Poland and Hungary, which are also often cited as sort of the case studies of illiberal democracy, of where a democratic path has been interrupted for whatever reason. Elsewhere in the region, you've got places like Lithuania or Slovakia or Slovenia that are generally doing well. Is there some common factor in the Hungaries and the Polands where a seemingly promising course hasn't been sustained?
Every country is a little bit different. I think that one common thread, I'd say a couple common threads that I think are interesting. One would be corruption. I think a feeling that these countries are giving an opening to rich people to kind of plunder the public resources is a common factor in I think leading populists claim to be addressing these issues. Now they themselves are being accused of corruption, so they have the shoes on the other foot. I think corruption is an issue that I think about. But Hungary's an interesting example. President Mr. Orban, was initially, after the end of the Cold War, a pro-democracy guy, and he even had a kind of unsuccessful tenure as prime minister, he was out of power, and I think he kind of learned from that experience kind of bad lessons. And when he came back into power, he systematically, went after kind of what you might call the guardrails of democracy: an independent judiciary, an independent press, and he, benefited from gerrymandering of legislative districts. So he basically made it possible to kind of stay in power, or kind of tilt the playing fields in his favor. It's possible that he could lose an election, but he's really stacked the decks, so it makes it very difficult for him to lose an election right now.
It's illiberal democracy basically being people who win a fair election but then don't govern democratically. Fair definition?
Yeah, I think so. What I would say, it could be a fair or unfair election, but I think the point about illiberal democracy, it's a democracy in name only, where you have an election, whether fair or not fair, but they're not the other guardrails that make it possible for the people to have a fair choice. So if you don't have a free press that can hold the government accountable, if your opposition is thrown into jail and legitimate opponents can't get on the ballot, if you restrict freedom of association or civil society so that they can't protest you, yes, you've been elected, but you haven't. But you don't have the other pieces of a society that can support a thriving democracy. And by the way, it's interesting that I think one good element of this is that the dictators do feel they have to have an election, whether they're fair or not fair. So Putin or Orban feel they have to have an election. They're not dispensing of that as you might have 40 or 50 years ago. But the problem is, once you get elected, you have to make sure that it's a fair process in terms of the future elections.
Do you think that model of illiberal democracy is sustainable over the long term, or are the pressures just going to inevitably lead to a change down the road?
That's a great question. I think history tells us that dictatorship is not stable. I mean, even the Soviet Union fell, and both of us grew up during the Cold War. I don't think I thought that I would, in my lifetime, see a world in which the Soviet Union, a communist totalitarian state, did not exist. So I think that's a good example of how you really. I do have hope, because I think if that could happen, I don't believe any of these dictatorships are sustainable in the long term. But we're going through a rough patch right now, and I think it's really important for us to be vigilant and aggressive in pointing out the flaws of these countries and pushing back against this kind of authoritarianism.
Maybe to close on that theme, there's a trend in the United States, certainly, towards less engagement overseas. Some call it isolationism or America First philosophy, or have other labels for it. Why, in your view, is it important that the U.S. leads on these issues internationally, that the U.S. speaks out about human rights and democracy?
I think it's very important that the U.S. speak out on these issues, because I think it's very much in the U.S. national security interest and economic interest to do so. We do not want to live in a world in which we are surrounded by people like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Viktor Orban, Nicolas Maduro. That is not the world. That's not a world in which Americans will feel safe, and I think that's not a world in which businesses and the other engines of American prosperity can thrive. So I think having a strong democracy support policy, a strong human rights policy is very important. Now, that doesn't mean that every great power has to make trade-offs, and no country is going to be perfect. And I think I used to be a reporter, and every president that I've seen has had to make some trade-offs between a pure human rights policy and a realist policy, if you will. But I do think we've kind of gotten lopsided the other way. I do think one other issue is that we do have to get our own house in order. I think one thing at Freedom House is that we have also recorded an erosion in U.S. democratic standards and norms over the last 10 years. We're obviously a very free country. We have a robust free press. I feel very bullish about the future of America, but I do think that erosion makes it hard for us to be a strong tribune of these issues, because people look at us and say, well, why are you lecturing us when your own country has problems, with calling the press enemies of the people and things like that. So I think it's very important you have to do both. You have to really support a strong, values-oriented U.S. foreign policy that puts these issues of human rights and democracy front and center, but you also have to try to repair democracy at home and make it stronger.
Each generation needs to sustain it and
Absolutely.
pay it forward. Okay. Mike Abramowitz, thanks very much for your time. Thanks for being with us.
Fun to be here. Thanks a lot, Lindsay.
Thank you.